It was supposed to be a trial. Instead, the judge gave her a choice: testify against the wounded stranger she'd hidden in her attic, or marry him before sunrise. In a courtroom packed with glares and silence, Sarah Whitmore stepped forward in her mourning dress and whispered, "I'll take the vow." But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The wind that night sounded like a thing alive, howling across the plains, shaking the shutters, creeping through every seam in the log walls of Sarah Whitmore's cabin. Snow drove sideways across the clearing, a white fist hammering her window panes. She'd banked the fire hours earlier, poured herself a half mug of cider, and settled into the old rocker with a book she already knew by heart. Outside, the world vanished into frost and silence. Inside, it was the kind of quiet she'd grown to revere. Then came the knock. Not a timid rap, not the call of a neighbor caught unprepared, but a dull, desperate pounding. It jolted her like a rifle shot, sent her to her feet before her mind caught up. She hesitated only once, fingers brushing the old pistol that hung from a nail by the door. Then she opened it. The snow blew in with a roar, and so did he. He stumbled through the threshold like a man chased by devils, slumped against the frame, coat torn, blood soaking through the shoulder, lips cracked from cold. His eyes locked onto hers for half a second, gray, frantic, and feral. And then he collapsed, right there on her floor. A stranger, bleeding into her solitude. Sarah stared for a beat longer than she should have. Enough time to remember the laws, enough time to calculate the risk. Harboring a fugitive, even a suspected one, could bring a fine, jail, worse. But there was something in his face, before it fell to the floorboards, something not of guilt, but of fear. Not a fear of being caught, but of being forgotten. She moved fast, bolted the door, stoked the fire, hauled him to the hearth with a strength born not of muscle but of necessity, stripped the wet coat, found the wound, clean, through and through, probably from a rifle. She boiled water, tore linen, worked with the steady hands of someone who'd once nursed a husband through fever, who'd once delivered a foal with nothing but prayer and grit. When his breathing evened out, she finally sat. Not far, just near enough to watch. And when he stirred hours later, fevered and dry-mouthed, she didn't ask questions, just gave him water and said softly, "You're safe. For now." She didn't know who he was, but she knew what it was to bleed in the dark and have no one open the door, and so she did. The name came 2 days later, spoken by a ranch hand half frozen on her porch delivering salted pork. "Marshall's got a reward out," he'd said casually, boots knocking mud loose on her steps. "Man named Luke Morgan, Union deserter. Dangerous, they say." His eyes flicked past her shoulder, but she didn't flinch. She just handed him his coin and closed the door slow, careful not to let the panic show. Inside, she stood still, listening. Luke Morgan lay in her loft beneath 2 quilts and a sky-blue afghan she hadn't touched since her husband died. His fever had broken that morning, and now he slept the thick sleep of someone just barely clawing their way back into their body. His rifle wound was healing. Not clean, but not festering. She'd packed it with pine pitch and bound it with boiled linen. He hadn't spoken much, just a few dry-throated words. Name. Water. Sorry. That one stuck. She hadn't told him she knew. Not yet. She went back to her chores, but her hands moved slower now, heavier. Milking the goat, splitting kindling, tending the fire. Her mind kept drifting to the military notice tacked outside the general store, the one she'd ignored out of habit. Desertion. A stain worse than cowardice in the eyes of this town. Folks here didn't care about the why, only the duty broken. the oath betrayed. But Sarah knew something different. She remembered war. Her husband Isaac had come back a stranger, haunted, trembling, talking in his sleep. She knew what killing did to a man, what following orders could cost a soul. That night, she ladled stew into a tin bowl and climbed the loft. Luke was awake, sitting upright, pale as ash, one hand pressed against his shoulder. "You should turn me in," he rasped. "You know who I am." She handed him the bowl, then sat across from him on a wooden crate, folding her hands in her lap. "I know what they say you are, not who." He stared at her, unsure whether it was mercy or madness that sat in front of him. "They'll come looking." "I'll handle it," she said. Silence settled between them, not soft but solid, like a stone in the middle of a frozen river. She didn't ask for his story. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because sometimes truth wasn't a matter of asking. It was a matter of choosing who you believed when no one else would. They rode in at dawn, like men who'd come to collect a debt the land had long been owed. The hooves of 3 horses pounded through the frost-crusted pasture like judgment arriving early, steam rising from their flanks, breath white in the blue light. Sarah was already at the stove when she heard them, didn't startle, didn't drop the ladle. She only glanced out the small window, then turned the flame down low. The biscuits would burn without supervision, but what came next would need her full attention. Marshal Abram Reeves dismounted with the stiffness of a man who didn't ride for the pleasure of it. He was tall, iron-bearded, and built like the gallows he served. 2 deputies trailed behind, younger, leaner, trying too hard to look hard. They weren't here to ask. They were here to take. Sarah stepped onto the porch in her housecoat and boots, hair tied in a loose knot, face bare and unreadable. The cold bit through the wool, but she didn't shiver. "Sarah Whitmore," the marshal said, though he already knew. She nodded once. "We've received report of a deserter harbored here, Luke Morgan. You'll let us in." She didn't argue, didn't stall, just stepped aside and said, "He's upstairs. 3rd step creaks." Reeves eyed her like a man trying to catch guilt mid-breath, then nodded to his deputies and entered. She didn't follow. She sat in the rocker on the porch, hands clasped in her lap, eyes on the pasture. When they brought Luke down between them, shirt half-buttoned, arms bound, he didn't look surprised, just tired. Their eyes met for a flicker of a second. She didn't blink. It took less than an hour to drag him into town. It took only a day to drag her name through it. The trial wasn't about justice. It was about example, about reminding every soul from the outskirts to the creek that law here didn't bend for pity. She stood in that courthouse, straight-backed in her mourning dress, while the judge read charges with a voice like gravel. "Aiding and abetting a fugitive, harboring a deserter of federal rank, perjury by omission." But what came next knocked the air from the room. "If the accused refuses to testify against the fugitive," the judge said, adjusting his spectacles, "then she may take on his legal burden through marital bond. The law permits it. She has until dawn to decide." Marry him, or hang. The courtroom didn't gasp. They just watched, waiting to see if the widow would fold. Sarah didn't look at Luke. She didn't speak. She only lowered her gaze and began to think. The town buzzed like a hornet nest prodded with a stick. Quiet at first, then steadily louder. Everywhere Sarah went, the air shifted behind her, as if her footsteps stirred more than dust. She heard it in the way the mercantile door creaked shut too quickly behind her. Saw it in the sideways glances over hymn books, the sudden stillness in the church aisle when she entered alone. They didn't speak to her, not directly, but their silence said plenty. Marry him, or hang. It wasn't a choice, not really. Hanging would have been quicker. Easier, maybe. But Sarah Whitmore had never been a woman drawn to ease. The law, in all its solemn absurdity, had left her with a sentence that wore the face of mercy. And yet what it demanded felt more like sacrifice than survival. She spent that evening in the old pews of the church, long after the candles had burned low and the janitor had stopped peeking in. The altar offered no answers. The stained glass saints didn't blink. And God, if he listened at all, kept his voice behind thunder and wind. She didn't pray. Not really. Just sat with the stillness and listened for the place inside herself that always knew. The same part that had once told her to hold Isaac's hand when he'd gasped his last, to dig her heels in when the taxes came due, to open the door when Luke Morgan bled on her doorstep. At sunrise, the frost cracked like eggshells beneath her boots as she crossed the square. Her dress was dark green wool, plain, practical, no veil, no flowers. Just a woman walking to bind her life to a man she barely knew, for the second time in her life, and for reasons no one else had ever dreamed of. The courtroom was packed, but silent. The judge's gavel had barely settled when he asked, "Have you reached a decision, Miss Whitmore?" She didn't hesitate. Her voice was clear, unshaking. "I'll marry him." A rustle swept the room like wind through dry corn. No applause, no comfort, only stillness. Luke stood near the jury box, flanked by 2 deputies. The color had returned to his face in the days since his arrest, but now it drained again. He looked at her like a man who'd been handed a life raft, and wasn't sure if he deserved it. He didn't smile, he didn't nod, but his eyes said everything. She had saved his life, again, and this time he had to live with it. They arrived back at the cabin the way mourners return from a grave, quiet, shoulders heavy, unsure what life looks like now that it's changed shape. Sarah unlocked the door like always, but this time it wasn't just her hand that touched the latch. It was theirs. The sound of it echoed different. Luke stepped inside first, ducking his head slightly beneath the beam. The same threshold he had once crossed, bloodied and near frozen, now welcomed him not as a fugitive, but as a husband, at least in name. He paused in the center of the room like he didn't know where to stand. She passed him, hung her shawl by the hearth, and started the fire without a word. There were no wedding bells, no vows exchanged beyond the legal ones scratched in courthouse ink, no kiss to seal anything but silence. And yet, from that day forward, the law called them bound. Their days were a choreography of necessity. Sarah kept to her chores with the same quiet diligence she always had, kneading bread at dawn, gathering eggs, sewing by lamplight when the wind howled. Luke worked without being asked. He chopped wood without nicking her fence, fed the goats without scaring them, fixed the shed roof without bragging. He said little, and she didn't push. There was no room in those first days for questions, only space to make the unbearable feel survivable. They slept in the same cabin, but not together. She gave him the cot near the stove. She kept the bed in the loft. No rules were spoken, but both observed them. The air between them was fragile as spun sugar, too loud a word, and it might shatter. And yet, one morning, she found the broken pantry door rehung, sanded smooth where the hinge used to catch. A day later, her lantern wick had been replaced, the flame burning steady and high. He never said he'd done it, but she knew. She mended his coat one evening, the one torn at the sleeve when they first found him. She stitched it in the corner chair with practiced fingers, folded it neat, and left it at the foot of his cot. The next day, it was gone from the chair, worn against the cold without comment. They didn't speak of what they were. Not husband, not wife, not really. But something passed between them in those small acts, something that resembled trust. Not love. Not yet. but a quiet blooming beneath frost, patient and stubborn, like spring roots working under snow. She hadn't gone into the attic in months, not since the early autumn when she'd stowed away Isaac's wool coat and the last of the canning jars. It was more storage than room, sloped under the pitch of the roof, filled with dust and silence. But a late freeze had threatened the roofline, and Sarah climbed the narrow ladder with a mind to patch what the winter had started to loosen. She moved slowly, breath visible in the chill air, her lantern sending flickers across cobwebbed beams and old trunks. There, tucked beneath a folded saddle blanket, was the small wooden box she didn't recognize. She didn't expect it to be his. Luke never brought more than a bedroll and a pack. But there it was, smooth pine, leather strap wrapped around twice, tied not with haste but with purpose. She hesitated only a moment before opening it. Inside lay folded shirts, a tin shaving mirror, a brass button, and at the very bottom, a letter. Unsent. The envelope was weathered but intact, addressed in dark ink. To Annie Morgan, Ash Hollow, Nebraska. She shouldn't have opened it. It wasn't hers. But her fingers moved before her conscience caught up, unfolding the single sheet until the words stared back at her like confession. Annie, I know you won't understand at first. I don't blame you. They called it necessary. Said they were hiding munitions. Said those women, those children were helping Confederates. But they were unarmed, crying, surrendering. And Captain Royce gave the order anyway. I was the only one who didn't pull the trigger. They called me a traitor. I call it still being able to sleep. I'm heading west. Don't worry about me. I'd rather be hunted than haunted. The lantern hissed slightly, its flame trembling as if it too had read the truth. Sarah sat back on her heels, letter limp in her hands. Her throat tightened, not with fear, not with doubt, but with something more complicated. A bone-deep ache for a man whose silence had never been cowardice, only the burden of a conscience too heavy to voice. He hadn't told her this. Maybe he hadn't planned to. But now she knew. He wasn't running from war. He was running from what war tried to make of him. The storm rolled in without warning, the sky turning bruise purple as thunder cracked like musket fire over the hills. Sarah had seen prairie storms before, seen rain come down in sheets and wind peel shingles off roofs like bark from trees. But this one felt different. It felt personal, as if the sky had held its breath too long and now came to release it all at once, violently. She was at the hearth when the lightning hit. The bolt cleaved through the barn's weather vane with a scream of light, and then the world split open. Fire caught fast, drier than it should have been in a winter like this, and within seconds, the roof was aflame. Red tore through black. The wind fed it. Sarah was already outside, boots half-laced, apron soaked with sleet. "Luke!" she shouted. But he was already running. He didn't stop for shoes, just bolted into the blaze, arm crooked against the smoke. The goats were still penned in, 3 of them, terrified, banging their horns against the walls. She could see them, silhouettes through flame. He came out first with Delilah, the old nanny goat, cradled like a child in his arms. His shirt was singed at the sleeve, his mouth open wide with breath that wouldn't come. He dropped her on the snowbank and turned back without pause. "Luke!" Sarah screamed. "No more!" But he didn't answer. A moment later, he stumbled out again, dragging a scorched pitchfork and the feed sack. He collapsed to his knees, coughing, eyes red with smoke. That was when the roof gave in. Flames climbed high into the sky, orange against the storm dark. Snow turned to steam where it touched the barn. Sarah fell to her knees beside him, wrapping his head in her apron, pressing his face to her chest, feeling his lungs shake under her hands. "Help!" she screamed into the black. "Somebody, please!" But no one came. The town was watching. Faces in windows, shadows on porches. Some stared, others turned away. Judgment, even now, held tighter than neighborly decency. By the time the fire burned out, only half the barn was left. Timbers black and bowed like bones in a field. The goats shivered beside them. The feed was gone. The tools gone. Luke sat beside her in the snow, barefoot, ash in his hair. His shoulders slumped, but his jaw clenched, still. Sarah looked at him, her face streaked with soot and tears and steam. And in a voice so low only he could hear it, she said, "I'm glad I opened the door." Not as thanks, but as truth. In the days after the fire, the wind shifted. Not in the sky, but in the town. Something in the flames had burned more than timber. It burned through certainty, scorched through gossip, and left behind a quiet kind of curiosity. They came not in crowds, not with casseroles or condolences, but one by one, neighbors with shoulders hunched like they hadn't meant to arrive. Mr. Vaughn, the blacksmith, stopped by for extra nails, though Sarah knew he had plenty. Mrs. Langley brought a jar of preserved peaches she claimed were a year too old to sell. No one mentioned the fire. No one mentioned the man they'd once branded a coward. But they lingered longer than they used to. Watched Luke longer than was polite. Sarah didn't engage. Not at first. She let them stand at the gate or on the stoop. She let them speak into silence and walk away with their own echoes. But Luke, he met them where they were. He didn't ask for their trust. He earned it the long way. He patched the cracked slats of the church fence without being asked. When the mill's roof blew off in a sudden gale, he climbed it himself, quiet, sure-footed, rope around his waist, hammer in hand. When Mrs. Adams lost her cow in the far hills, Luke spent a full day tracking prints through muddy snow. Returned at dusk, coat torn, hat lost, and the cow roped gently behind him like an apology. He didn't speak much, but he showed up. And the town began to change. Not all at once. Not with warmth, but with pauses. The kind that happen when someone goes to say a cruel thing and the words get caught. When a whisper dies in the throat because someone remembers the look on Sarah's face the night of the fire. Or the way Luke limped down Main Street with shingles slung over his shoulder, not asking for pay. No one forgave him. Not out loud. That would have required admitting they were wrong. But they began to forget. Not what he did, but why they cared. And perhaps that was better. Because forgiveness is a gift. But forgetting, that's a surrender. And for a man who had never asked for anything, it was more grace than he expected. Sarah saw it all, quietly, from the porch, from the windows. She watched a town undo a little of its hate, not because it was good, but because he gave it nowhere left to cling. The spring fair returned to Willow Bend like a long-held breath finally exhaled. After a winter of ash and silence, the town dressed itself in ribbons and fresh paint, as if trying to forget the char and smoke that still lingered in memory. Tables lined the main street, covered in gingham and preserves, patchwork quilts fluttering on clotheslines like prayer flags. The air smelled of fried apples, pine shavings, and honeysuckle just beginning to bloom. Sarah stood by the tree line in her best dress, the navy one with tiny cream-colored flowers and a hem that brushed her boots. Her hair was plaited down her back, her cheeks warm, not from sun, but from something deeper, something unspoken. In her right hand, folded twice and ironed smooth, was a pale yellow handkerchief stitched with her initials. It was simple cotton. But in this town, it meant everything. The handkerchief dance was tradition, old as the fair itself. A woman offered the cloth. A man accepted. They danced, not as lovers, not always, but as something truer, mutual recognition. Luke stood near the stage, arms crossed loosely, watching the fiddler warm up. He hadn't shaved. His boots were dusty, but he wore the coat she'd mended, the one with the patched sleeve and polished buttons. And when he saw her across the green, his eyes did a strange thing. They steadied. She didn't walk fast. She let the breeze push against her skirts, let the murmurs follow in her wake. The people parted for her not out of awe, but acknowledgement. There were no whispers now, just waiting. She stopped in front of him and looked up, eyes calm but unreadable. Then she extended the handkerchief. Luke didn't move at first, not out of hesitation, but disbelief, as if no one had ever offered him a thing that wasn't conditional, as if he couldn't quite trust it was real. Then, slowly, his fingers reached forward and took the cloth from her hand, gently, like it might vanish if he gripped it too hard. The fiddler struck up a tune, old and familiar, full of lift and longing, and Luke extended his arm. She stepped into his hold without looking away, and then they danced. No spectacle, no cheers. Just two people in the center of a crowd that had once wanted nothing to do with either of them. Two people turning in time with music, and something older than melody, something born of silence and survival and choice. The song didn't last long, but it didn't have to. The truth was already out there, folded in cotton, spoken in steps. The dogwood tree behind their cabin bloomed late that year, petals like small white stars against a sky scrubbed clean by spring. Its roots curled deep into the soil where ash from the burned barn had long since softened into memory, and its branches arched wide, as if reaching to bless the clearing below. That was where Sarah stood, dress yellow as buttercup, feet bare in the new grass. There were no chairs, no preacher, no ribbons or garlands, just a table with a jar of water, 2 cups, and a torn black Bible, pages worn thin from calloused hands. Luke stood across from her, a simple shirt tucked into worn trousers, sleeves rolled to his elbows, sun on the back of his neck. He held the Bible like it might split if he squeezed too hard. His voice was steady, low when he read. Just one passage, about grace and choice, and the strength it takes to bind two people with nothing but their own will. Sarah didn't need the words. She watched his face instead, the scar above his brow, the place where his jaw always tensed when he was nervous, the crease in his cheek that hadn't been there last year. She knew him now, not as the stranger at her door, not as the fugitive she'd hidden, not even as the man the law had pressed into her life. She knew him as the one who stayed, and when he finished reading, he looked up. Her voice came clear, shaped by months of unspoken truths. "We didn't get to choose the beginning," she said, "but we stayed through the middle, and now I want the rest. Not because I have to, because I do." He didn't answer, just reached for her hand, slow and certain, and held it like it was something earned. The breeze stirred the dogwood petals, sending a few drifting like snow between them. The sky was quiet. The town was distant, and for once, neither past nor future held dominion over the moment. They poured the water, drank it in turn, and said no more vows than that. No rings, no signatures, just the sun on their faces and the shared breath of something true. Sarah felt it in her ribs, in the marrow of her spine, that this time, nothing had been taken. This time, something had been built, not with permission, but with faith.